Thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. Before we get to today's episode, we want to take a quick moment and let you know that CityWorks Expo 8, Anticipating 2050, Acting Today, will be occurring October 4th through 6th in Roanoke, Virginia. We've got some really exciting speakers and some other activities lined up that we're excited about. If you all are interested, please check us out at cityworksexpo.com. That's cityworksexpo.com. And real quick, before we get to today's episode, just want to let you all know that we'd really appreciate if you could give us a rating and review on whatever platform you're listening to this, whether that be Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever else you might be finding it. This rating and review really help other people find out about the podcast and the incredible guests that we have. But now, without further ado, let's get on to today's episode.
Please listen carefully.
Welcome to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. My name is Brad Stevens, and I'll be your host today. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to our guest, Miss Maureen Brondyke, Executive Director of New City Arts. How are you doing today, Maureen?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing very well. It's I don't know what it's like in Charlottesville today, but it's absolutely beautiful down here in Roanoke.
Yeah, it is lovely. We are experiencing another day in the 70s, which is awesome.
I'm not quite ready for it, but I suppose we have to accept it.
Yeah.
Well, I wonder, Maureen, if you could kind of kick us off and tell us a little bit about how you define the work that you do.
Sure. So New City Arts, where I work, is a community arts organization that has a twofold mission. We support artists and we facilitate cultural participation, specifically in Charlottesville, Virginia. So the work that we do is contextualized to this place. And the reason why is because we believe the arts are both life-giving and community building. And so this mission kind of informs everything we do. If we break it down and talk about what it looks like to support artists, in Charlottesville, we're a small town, but we also have a really high cost of living for a small town. And so based on what we've heard artists need in our community, our work is focused on providing them places to show and sell their work, places for them to physically work, studio space, providing them with financial support, and providing them with community, friendships, relationships, connections to other artists and also people interested in the arts in Charlottesville. When we talk about facilitating cultural participation, at New City Arts, we're particularly interested in welcoming those who don't think the arts are for them. And for us, this includes local congregations. And the way that we do this is probably as important or more important than sort of the what. We really focus on hospitality at each of our events. So when you show up to Welcome Gallery, the gallery that we run downtown, you'll always find a greeter at the door who's going to welcome you, say hi, provide you with the information you need, show you where the food is. We try to have name tags at as many events as possible. All of our events are free or low cost, open to the community. Most of them are accessible by public transportation. And we really value participatory engagement. So, a really good example of this is an event we host called Charlottesville Soup, which there's a soup in Roanoke as well, right? What's it called?
A Big Lick Soup.
Yeah. So we run the Charlottesville version of that, which is a really good example of how we both support artists and facilitate cultural participation, because we're similar to what you all are doing in Roanoke. We're sharing a meal together. We have artists present on their work. The people who are sharing a meal together have a really open conversation about which artists they love the most, why they think that art is important, what they think Charlottesville needs in terms of creativity and the arts. And then they vote for the artists that they want to receive funding. So it's a very participatory act where the people who are at the event feel really connected to the work that's being created or produced. So we try to create that kind of environment, that participatory environment, in a lot of the events that we do, whether it's through Q&A or whether it's through like actually deciding, who gets the funding. So yeah, I can talk a lot more about that, but that's sort of our sort of twofold mission. And all the work we do is kind of focused around those two things.
That's as I'm hearing you talk about, I'm really intrigued by this kind of idea and what it of hospitality, and what it brings to mind for me is this idea that art can often feel very elitist and hard to understand sometimes. And it sounds like what you guys are doing are trying to give a lot of those tools and making accessibility a real thing with art.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in my own experience, even though I was an art major in college, galleries in particular, which we run a gallery, can feel very like not for you. So it often feels like you have to know what to wear. You have to know this like very specific language. You have to understand like where to go. Even for us, First Fridays is kind of from like 5 to 8, like in the community, but every gallery is open at a different time. So the schedule can be confusing. And there's lots of, the NEA has a great report on what barriers actually exist to arts participation. And one of those things is actually having no one to go with. So galleries can often feel like a really lonely experience, especially when, you show up, you're by yourself, you don't feel confident that you know what to do, but you feel like this is a free thing I could do on a Friday night. So as an example of like how we've tried to address that particular barrier, a few years ago we launched these First Friday small groups where you can email us and we'll actually pair you with other people to walk around the First Fridays too, so that you do have someone to go with when you want to go to First Fridays. But yeah, trying to overcome a lot of those barriers and making a space. I mean, our gallery is called Welcome Gallery for a reason. We want kids to feel welcome. Parents are often one of the groups that feel like a gallery isn't for them because they have to watch their kids. And there is an element to that, right? Like if work is hung really close to the floor or there's sculpture, we try to give parents a heads up in advance that, there's sculpture on the floor or paintings are hung low to the wall. But we also host a monthly event called New City Arts and Crafts where we facilitate like an art making event for an hour. So there's free coffee for the parents. There's free food for everyone. Tattly sponsors it, so we have temporary tattoos available for all the kids, which has become one of my favorite things. Kids will come in the gallery and ask for tattoos first before they want to look at the work. We do a reading time, and that way parents get to actually see the work because often they can't come to First Fridays. The kids get to engage with the work because the craft is always inspired by the art that's up. And more than anything, it kind of communicates to families like, hey, we want you here. You're welcome here. There's a child who was, her mom went into labor after a First Friday, and she has come to every First Friday since she's been born, which is like one of my favorite things. So making it a really intentional intergenerational space where kids can feel like they can be there and their parents feel like we're really happy to have them. That's definitely like a huge part of what we do, not just in the gallery, but in all the events and spaces we facilitate.
Well, I think that really speaks to part of what I think is so amazing about the work that you guys do in terms of you can really tangibly hear in those stories about how you guys are building a community. But I wonder kind of if you can talk a little bit about why the arts are such an important place to build that community. You could build that around, a number of different things. Sports is, comes to mind. We've congregations I know you guys have talked about, but why are the arts so important to build a community there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that when creative activities happening both in large and small ways throughout a community, it creates this sort of surprising ripple effects of benefits, even for those who don't participate directly. And those benefits are twofold. So the first is the economic vitality of an area. So not unlike sports or a stadium, when you go out to a theater or a gallery or a concert, it means there's more energy and life in a community. We often find that people go out for dinner or drinks before or after a show. Sometimes they'll get a babysitter. You might plan a weekend vacation around an event. And often places like small theaters, community galleries, they make a town or a city a place we want to live or a place that we want to call home, because it gives a town this sort of character and economic vitality. Maybe more interesting to me, and probably more of a value that we highlight in the work that we do, is that the arts really improve how communities come together and how they understand one another. So when you think about a vibrant arts community with storytelling, music, community arts centers, you think about people coming together to experience and share ideas, participate in exchanges, providing children with more opportunities to experience art, and providing all of us with ways to connect with each other and understand each other, creating like social attachment to a community, and just facilitating new relationships. I mean, there's a lot I could say here, and maybe we'll get into this more later, but I think I forget how rare it is that galleries are a place where people like physically come together to experience something new, because so often, outside of work or sort of our usual routine, we're experiencing media or culture or conversations online, maybe through social media, in a way that is segmented, in a way that is very curated with people that we are already connected to or people whose ideas we share. And I think that one of the most powerful things when we're talking about how communities come together and understand each other is that a community art space can be a place where people who don't know each other, who aren't the same age, who maybe don't share the same worldview, can come together in a physical space and be surprised by something they didn't expect to see, connect over a print or a photograph or a painting that they love for whatever reason. Like, it's totally subjective, but maybe they love, it reminds them of something, it's nostalgic for them, it provides them with hope, it teaches them something about the world that they're really open to, it's really interesting, they're impressed by the creativity. And I think seeing that happen across community lines, across generational lines, is one of the most powerful things to me about why the arts are so important, because it can produce empathy in ways that really are facilitated by vulnerability, without really knowing that that's what you're doing, right? Like, you're not going to a gallery saying, like, I really want to have more empathy. And I mean, maybe some people do, but most people go to Church Fridays or an exhibit opening because they know the artist, or it's something they love to do, or maybe they want, some really nice cheese and crackers, or it's just like a free thing to do before dinner. But I think that those sort of like surprising ripple effects or benefits are some of the most interesting kind of byproducts to me about why the arts are so important, especially in a small town.
Well, I'm wondering, because I think that what we've often found is that, in order to make that community happen and in order to get those people to come out and have those experiences, there has to be an authenticity to it. And like you said, I don't think that you could go out and say, hey, come to our First Fridays event because you're going to learn empathy. But you have to build an experience that's going to lead to that, but also be authentic in that space. And I'm wondering how you guys kind of make sure that those experiences that they're having are meaningful. And I'm sure that they're not always that way, but what have you guys learned is successful in that space?
Yeah. So I'll say two things about this. The first is that New City Arts, our galleries opened in 2010. But at the time, it was actually in partnership with a radio station, so we didn't have our own space, but instead we facilitated monthly exhibits at this partnership space, which was a really low-cost, pretty low-risk way to start presenting work, facilitating relationships with artists, inviting the community to a free event. This really lovely, wonderful store in Charlottesville, in restaurant called Feast, catered every month and had these beautiful, like, cheese boards where you could basically, eat a small plate before you went out and had dinner. Some people probably made it their dinner, which is what it's there for. And we did that for 5 years, every month. And looking back at that time, I think that it helped us. I mean, again, this wasn't necessarily intentional, but we started very slow, and our priority was to build relationships with artists and help them have a really good experience in that space, help them, work on their artist statement, work on their artist talk, hang their show, staff the event, demonstrate how much we valued their work, and also just genuinely and authentically welcome the community into that space, which was a quirky space, right? It's not a typical gallery. It was a radio station. So they were incredibly generous to let us run these events for 5 years in their space. And we did a lot of work to help people feel welcome. And when we opened Welcome Gallery in 2015, I think that those relationships and a lot of the community building work we had done for those first 5 years meant that people already knew us, right? It was familiar to come to New City Arts, even though it was a totally new place. We had relationships with artists. I think at the time we opened the gallery, we had shown work by over 150 unique Charlottesville artists in that time period. Many of whom had gone on to get MFAs or moved to new towns. But I think that I don't know for sure. You'd have to ask someone who comes. But I think that really getting to know both the regulars and artists who are exhibiting, it does help build, the word social capital comes to mind, but it helps build authentic relationships that help facilitate this sort of authentic community. And honestly, the other thing that came to mind when you asked that question is trying to not take ourselves too seriously. So the gallery is serious. We treat the work very seriously. Obviously, we getting a show at Welcome Gallery is a competitive community application process. And we work with artists to put on these really good shows, but we do have temporary tattoos that kids can come in and get. We always welcome people at the door, as I mentioned, and I think that, I don't know, maybe not taking ourselves too seriously is kind of the wrong phrase, but just being really intentional with how we greet people, and even how we talk about upcoming events. Often, if you receive our emails, we'll try to use puns in our communication, or just be really straightforward about what we're doing. Because information barriers, not knowing where to go, or not knowing the time, or not really knowing what's going on, are another huge barrier of participation to the arts. So through our communication and marketing, we try to be transparent and vulnerable and a little funny, because the arts can often be seen as really serious. And so they are serious, but the more whimsical you can be about the event that's taking place, I think the more people feel like that place is for them, even if they don't necessarily have an arts background or, haven't been going to First Fridays forever.
I love that. I think we'd probably all be better if we had more whimsy in every part of our lives.
Yeah. What is your experience with, I'm less familiar with art spaces in Roanoke. Do you all have First Fridays or something like it?
I honestly don't know, which probably speaks volumes in and of itself in some ways. I know that we do have some open gallery times. They're not spaces that I am particularly comfortable with, and so they're not things that I have ever really explored. I have a number of friends that are artists that I've even commissioned some work from them, but I've not been to their kind of shows when they come about.
Yeah. I think that relationship, I think often for us at First Fridays, I'll try to pay attention to, who's there, and if it's someone I know or someone I recognize. And we find that about 40 to 50% of the people that come to openings are change over each month because they are people that know the artist, and that's why they're there. So that relationship component of like, I know the artist is often a big driver to why people would show up at something, especially for the first time. So anyways, I feel like the next time one of your artist friends has an opening, that might be a good time to check something out.
It's one of those things I should probably do, but I have been negligent thus far. But I do think it takes back to, I think something that came to me when you were last talking was just that, you started with these relationships. And I think that even here we're hearing that again, that these relationships are what get people out to events. I don't know how many times I wouldn't have gone to something unless somebody had personally invited me to be there. And it's a good reminder in some ways, I think, that individual relationships are the foundation for strong communities.
Mm-hmm. I found that certainly to be true at Expo this past year. I felt like there was definitely this core community of people in Roanoke that are definitely a part of the co-working space and part of the conference. And it feels like this community that is really intentionally thinking about what they want Roanoke to look like, what kind of new initiatives they can support in the community to improve the community. And you're absolutely a crucial part of that. And I feel like it was really encouraging for me to be a part of that because it's rare that I actually leave Charlottesville, and coming to Roanoke was a really great experience, and it was really encouraging and fun to meet the people that sort of surround you in the work that y'all are doing.
Well, I appreciate your kind words. I'm kind of intrigued to take that back to that, idea of leaving your space that, you mentioned contextualization a while ago, and I'm intrigued, I've been involved in the soup event that happens here in Roanoke, and from talking to you, it's a very different experience than the soup event that happens in Charlottesville. I'm wondering kind of how that runs through the vein of all your work, kind of how you guys have been able to contextualize your work to make sure it fits the Charlottesville framework that you're working in.
Yeah, that's a great question. Soup is wonderful. It's one of my favorite events to attend. And it looks different all over the country. It was actually, for us here in Charlottesville, it was started by one of our resident artists who had heard about it and really wanted to bring it to our community. And we thought that New City Arts could be a good resource and support system for making that event happen. It absolutely aligned with our mission. And specifically with soup, I know in some communities, finalists and presenters there might be a creative or arts component to the work, but it's more about community development work. And so it crosses sectors and fields and can look like a lot of different things. In Charlottesville, the first soup that we hosted, we did have a really wide range of applicants, and the only requirement was that the arts were there was some kind of creative component to the work, no matter what it was. But we actually had like a handful of nonprofits apply to be presenters, and in Charlottesville there is, I would say, like a philanthropic network and community that absolutely wants to support ways to make our community better, whether it's, talking about food, whether we're talking about transportation, the environment, all sorts of different things. But the arts, while we are absolutely pride ourselves on being a sort of quirky and creative place, there isn't a lot of financial support for individual artists' work. And so after the first soup, we, based on feedback from attendees and the other facilitators, and just looking at the applications and realizing that there wasn't, I would say that we're pretty plugged into the artists in our community. And so realizing that there wasn't really a steady stream of financial support for individual artist work, like producing an album and like all the costs that come along with that, or all the costs that come along with like producing a new body of work, or trying to, maybe you want to take like a new workshop, like a letterpress class or something to like further your skills or broaden the skills that you have as a printmaker. There's all sorts of costs that go into photography and putting together a photography show. we realized that there just wasn't a lot of financial support for that kind of work. And so after the first soup, we limited applications only to individual artists who, of course, especially when you're thinking through social practice, there's tons of artists whose work absolutely overlaps with community development outcomes, but we wanted to prioritize the work that artists was making, whether it's like literally producing an album. Like there isn't a lot of financial support for that. And in terms of the scale of the SOUP grant, King now gives us a matching grant for the funds that are pooled at the event. So the grant kind of at this point averages between $2,500 and $3,000. And when we're thinking about scale, that can go a really long way to help someone offset the cost of producing a body of work, which is much different than a project where the budget is like, $15,000, $20,000. So that's kind of how we shifted our, and I don't know a lot about Big Lick Soup, so I'm not really sure. Do you all have, is it mostly focused around, I guess, is it limited to artists, or is it open to kind of anyone in the community who has a project they need support for?
So we, I think this is a great example of this contextualization thing, because I think that we, there's no doubt that Charlottesville and Roanoke are very different communities. And so we have opened that up to anybody, because our mission is less, I don't think that we have this one community, although there's certainly that same issue of the arts need support, financial support in a way here that is probably just as strong as they do in Charlottesville. But there's also we decided to focus on this bigger need of we as a community don't tend to think creatively about things. We tend to think there's a common saying that Roanoke is 5 to 10 years behind everybody else, so that when you guys have had an idea for 10 years, somebody in Roanoke is like, oh, that's a great idea, we should do that here. Which is not always the worst thing in the world, because it means we get to weed out the bad ideas before they happen. But, there's this, we would like, those of us involved with SOUP and to some degree Expo as well, would love us to start thinking more creatively. Instead of saying people shutting down new ideas, we want to shift that conversation to, okay, you have this idea, how can we make that happen? And so we've very intentionally made it as open and broad of an invite as possible.
Yeah. So I think I think the contextualization element runs through all the work we do. Because of our work with congregations, we often get inquiries from other communities about how they can do this kind of work in, fill in the blank, whether it's, I don't know, another town. And we often have conversations with those, whether it's artists or community leaders or pastors. And the first thing that we'll ask is, what the needs are in their community. Because if New City Arts existed in New York or in Seattle or in Roanoke, it would look very different. The programs that we do are in response to what we think artists need in our community, and the resources we're connected to, whether it's partnership organizations or partner congregations, and our values, how we want that work to be accomplished. And it's absolutely contextualized to scale and need. So I think that, with SOUP as an example, I think with SOUP looking different across communities is appropriate, and is kind of the beauty of creating a model that can be adapted to different communities depending on who the leaders are, what resources are available, what the community needs. I think that's a great thing.
Well, I really want to dig into some of this congregational stuff, but before we do that, I'm kind of intrigued that I think that part of what also I really like about what you guys do, and as I hear you here, it keeps coming up to my mind, is this idea of you guys obviously leading in some ways, but also being a supporter in many ways. And I think that role as a supporter is one that we don't often value as much as we should. And I wonder if you can kind of talk a little bit about what that means to you in some ways, to be there supporting artists and supporting that community in some ways.
Yeah, so I think another word that comes to mind very similar to supporter is facilitator. And it's really important to us that we create spaces to highlight work that artists are doing and let them kind of lead the way. We have a lot of programs that are actually artist-led, and one of the most important things about being a facilitator is being a really active listener. And for New City Arts, one of the most important things is that we're listening to our community partners, we're listening to artists in town, and honestly that our programs are flexible enough to accommodate a really wide range of needs because needs change over time. And while we want structures in place like Welcome Gallery to be able to facilitate all sorts of events and programs and exhibits, that role of facilitator is very important to us. We feel like when you talk about the work of building community, facilitating opportunities, but also facilitating relationships is a really core component of that work. I make a lot of jokes about how much I love to be a matchmaker, like in my, side hustle. But I really love setting people up who I feel like, I'm not talking about Bumble, but I really love setting people up who have common interests or whose strengths really complement one another. And I feel like as an organization, we're trying to create events or spaces that, absolutely facilitate opportunities, facilitate connection, facilitate relationships that can improve our community, that can be effective. And sometimes that role is more active than less, right? We do something called the New City Artist Exchange, where we choose 10 to 15 artists to make work for one another, and they exchange it with each other. And there's multiple thinners that are a part of this, and those artists start following each other on Instagram. They come to each other's shows. We hope they become friends. Maybe they'll start dating. Just kidding. But I think that that's a good example of kind of being a very active facilitator, which I guess is true of almost all of our programs. But that particular program feels like, we're sort of curating a body of work and trying to connect. I mean, artists come into this space all the time. One of the best things about running a public art space is that artists come in and say, hey, I just moved here and I'm really curious, what there is to do in town, or, what restaurants you would recommend. There's 2 of us on staff, and we often joke that I sort of play this concierge role where I love to make recommendations of, neighborhoods where people should visit or check out. And Lindsay, our program manager, often plays this role of counselor. She'll come in and people will introduce themselves and then pour out their hearts to her, which I just think that those 2 roles are things that when you think about a career in the arts, it's not what you think of first. But in terms of being a facilitator, we're really opening ourselves up to all sorts of interactions and possibilities. Which, goes alongside obviously being a supporter of artists in Charlottesville. And the other thing that comes to mind when we think of supporter is trying to make Charlottesville a place where artists can live and want to live, which has as much to do with resources like studio space as it has to do with social attachment and providing a community where they feel welcome and connected. And there's all sorts of organizations and spaces doing that really effectively here.
We'd like to take a moment now to say thank you to our sponsors today. The Urban Affairs and Planning program at Virginia Tech School of Public and International Affairs offers an interdisciplinary approach to understanding planning and policy for megaregions, cities, suburbs, and rural regions in the U.S. and abroad. UAP faculty have expertise in urban planning, architecture, urban design, economics, geography, political science, law, technology, and engineering, and provide students with a multifaceted understanding of how communities grow and change. Students apply their knowledge and professional skills by participating in real-world problem-solving with community clients through project-based studios and applied research. UAP emphasizes technical analysis and policy evaluation in approaching the complexities of modern communities. So a big thanks today to the Urban Affairs and Planning program down at Virginia Tech for being our sponsor. If you'd like to hear more, check them out online. But without further ado, we'll get back to today's guest. Thank you. Very interesting. Well, I know that, to kind of segue here, you guys also facilitate some relationships with the faith-based community in Charlottesville. Can you talk a little bit about how that works for you all?
Yeah, absolutely. So New City Arts was founded by a group of artists and pastors from different congregations who wanted a way to create a network of artists in the community that included artists from their congregations, while also providing really necessary resources for artists in the community, whether it's studio space or exhibit space or financial resources. And a huge part of that vision was to create more opportunities for conversation across those two groups. And I'm sort of broadly talking about local congregations and the arts community. And to briefly share kind of a more personal story, I was a printmaking major in college and was also an active part of a congregation. And for me personally, it was fairly surprising, and I don't think this is true of everyone's experience, but it was very surprising to me how distinct or distant those two communities were. Often there wasn't a lot of overlap between my friends that were in my art major and my friends that, I was with on Sundays or throughout the week at small group. And it was surprising because those are two communities that are actively asking really deep questions about the world and existence, and in a way that's incredibly vulnerable and really natural. And I felt like it made me feel at home in both communities, because those were questions I was used to regularly asking or exploring, whether it's through a practice of printmaking or whether it was through worship on Sunday morning. And it's also two places, I was joking about this with someone recently, but the only two places where I've sung with other people in the last 2 months was at a community sing at the gallery and in a sanctuary on Sunday morning. So this kind of act of like physically gathering, and whether it's singing together or exploring these really deep questions together, it felt like there was more common ground than not within those two sort of social groups. And so a lot of the work that New City Arts does is around facilitating relationships between those two communities. And that is the primary way that we are actively doing that, is through relationship building. So our board is ecumenical, and each of our board members is a supporter of the arts, interested in creativity, and also an active member of a local congregation. And they really serve as this bridge between the arts community and their congregation. And when we talk about cultural participation, one of their roles is to facilitate, to help get information and resources to their congregation so that their fellow parishioners know about First Fridays or know about events that we're hosting. And I think that there's a lot of, when we host events that really delve into content, so we co-host an event called the Maker Series with an art space called the Garage and Christ Episcopal Church in town, and we have 3 artists come and share about their process and their work. And in the last few, we've actually themed them around a topic. So one was on the art of failure, and it's a space where artists can really freely explore. There was one last fall on the art of reconciliation, and artists really show their process and their work and introduce their work to the people that are there. It's a free event that happens, on a Monday night. But then they also delve into this content, and it's actually in a physical church space, which is pretty unique. I think that's one of the only programs we host in a church building. Although Soup actually also happens at Christ Church pretty frequently. But it's the people that come to that event are, it's a very intergenerational crowd, but I think a lot of them are really interested in the experience of beauty, the process of creativity, and what that means to them, both how it relates to their experience in their own community in Charlottesville, but also how it informs and interacts with their worldview. So a lot of the work we're doing is just facilitating events and spaces at that kind of intersection of the local church and the arts community.
So, to go one of my biggest things is I tell this story on many of these podcasts, and the listeners are probably tired of hearing it at this point. But I talk a lot about going to the mall here in Roanoke, which always makes me sad in any number of ways. But one of them is almost always that I don't know anybody when I go to the mall, and it shocks me that in a town as small as Roanoke, knowing as many people as I do, I can go to the mall and not see anybody that I recognize. And so then the question for me becomes, what do we have to do to get these folks at the mall engaged in some of the community things that we're looking at doing? And I think some of that stuff reverberates into the churches as well. And so I think a lot of questions that, are the same in terms of how do we get congregations to engage in these issues that are community issues. And I think that, for me personally, as someone who's grown up in the church, that those issues seem very clear and those connections seem very clear, but that doesn't mean the connections are always very easy to make.
Yeah. We should sideline the mall conversation because I'm also, I actually went to the mall when I was in Roanoke. And I love going to malls. And I love running into like walkers at malls. Like sometimes you go to the mall and people are like actively exercising at malls, which I think is really interesting. It's like a gym for them. Anyways, I think that I've talked about this in the last year to a couple of different people, but like it's really interesting to me what it would look like to bring like a performance or some kind of public art something into a mall. I think that would be really fun.
Well, do they still do? When I was growing up in Charlottesville, they did all the student artwork was displayed once a year in the mall. Do they still do that?
Yeah, I have absolutely seen that. There's different like student initiatives where they'll like select a certain number of pieces and they'll show them at these sort of like kiosks in the mall. I feel like a more interesting thing would be like having, and I'm sure this has happened, but having like a flash mob, at a mall. I mean, that probably has definitely happened, but like taking that kind of structure and having like, a pop-up opera or like, I mean, they're public spaces that are huge and have like crazy acoustics, and are absolutely not a place where you would expect something like that to happen. And I just think it would be fun. I mean, when I was in college, which was the last time that I was like actively making any kind of art, ironically, one of the last projects that I really wanted to do and never did was I really wanted to knit the cul-de-sac my parents lived on with like with this. I don't know what the actual material is called, but it's like stuff you can drive over. And I think that when you take something fun like that, like knitting or some kind of craft, or like a site, and you make it a site-specific installation in a place where people are not expecting to see something like that, it can create this really surprising, I think, fun connection or interaction that, again, not what you expect when you go to the mall to like try to find jeans. You're not expecting to see like a pop-up opera performance. But anyways, we should have another conversation about the mall. Maybe we could have soup at the mall. I think having soup at the mall would be super fun. You could have like a Cinnabon for dessert or something. Anyways, back to your question. Can you repeat your question? Because now we just talked about the mall for like 5 minutes.
That's amazing. My mind is going a million miles an hour trying to figure out what we can do at the mall now. But essentially, how do you get these groups of people that can do incredible good but aren't always engaged in the questions that we're engaged in? How do you get them comfortable engaging it with those things?
Yeah. And I want to caveat this. I know this isn't what you're saying either, but absolutely there are people within all of our congregational partners who are actively participating in the arts already, are professional artists or working artists who are regularly exhibiting in galleries, really comfortable at First Fridays. And I just want to sort of caveat that by saying that when we talk about facilitating cultural participation, we're specifically thinking about people that are part of congregations who are not currently active in things like First Fridays or going to community theater, that sort of thing. So for us, I think that, and this is a conversation you and I have had before, but as someone who is a part of a church community, there are enough, events, whether it's like small group or choir or, things that are related to community engagement, but that are facilitated by the church. There's so much of that can fill your sort of weekly calendar that there isn't honestly like extra time to do things like go to First Fridays. And churches are one of the places where I feel like there is a ton of social attachment. It's a place where people have common ground and are building connections, again, often across generational lines. It's a place where, churches do a great job making families feel really welcome. And I think that, honestly, community engagement is a matter of just time and prioritizing that sort of thing because, we're all incredibly busy, and it's not going to First Fridays or experiencing art if it's not like on the top of your mind or it's not something you're already interested in, it might not be a priority. And so for us, some of the work we're doing is what our priority is to try to facilitate that kind of engagement and help congregational partners, or again, people who feel like within those congregations, people that feel like the arts aren't for them, or, asking questions like, why do the arts matter, to just introduce them to something like First Fridays or an exhibit. We often say that if someone comes to First Fridays at Welcome Gallery for the first time, it's the first time they've come to First Fridays, it's the first time they've heard about it, they come to experience an exhibit because, very, very frequently it's because they know the artist. A lot of the artists that we show are part of congregations. It's not, that isn't like something we ask in the application process. Just through our community and our network, a lot of those artists are connected to us. And so sometimes they'll bring a totally different crowd. And when that crowd, if we hand them a map and they also go to the Bridge and 2nd Street or Chroma or McGuffey, and it's their first time in one of those spaces, that is a great outcome for us. Like if we're introducing a new audience to First Fridays or to arts in the community, that is important to us. It is incredibly hard to measure, right? Like it's not, we're not like measuring membership. In fact, we would be measuring membership in like other organizations if we were actually measuring that outcome. But we do often ask of our audiences, we do ask if this is their first time, why they came, and if they're going to other galleries. And I think that that kind of community engagement where these two overlapping but sometimes separate communities can interact in a welcoming, hospitable space and connect over, the beauty of a print or a photograph, that is really wonderful, I think. And, often a conversation they might strike up a conversation, find out they have mutual friends. Like we've definitely had artists who have participated in like the artist exchange, or who have been resident artists who have met other artists in the community that definitely overlap those two communities, and they've started collaborating together. And I think that those connections and happenings are really wonderful, and allow artists to kind of meet I'm using the church like very broadly, but allow artists to kind of meet people who are actively a part of local congregations in a space that is really comfortable for them, have conversations that feel really natural across those two communities about, worldview, about creativity, about imagination, and just create more connections at this sort of intersection that's really important and interesting.
Well, I'm intrigued, kind of some of my past experience has been that this busyness is in the church is so overwhelming that it's often hard to get them to look outside, and it can be a very insular thing. So how have you kind of gotten churches to do that, or is it mainly in the individuals within the church that you guys have been able to connect with?
Say both, and that this is an area that we continue to grow in. And even though it's what makes New City Arts distinct, having congregational partners, having an ecumenical board, I also think that we've done a lot of work building trust and friendships and relationships in the community. And so just being totally frank and honest, this is an area where we want to focus on and grow in the next few years. I think the first thing that comes to mind is definitely relationships. So just through friendships and through natural connections, which, again, we talked about this in the beginning, but, having someone to go with to a community arts event is one of the most important facilitators of actual attendance or engagement. And so building out those kinds of connections and relationships within the church community, of course that has already been present, but with individuals, I think that's been kind of the primary facilitator when we talk about engagement. We also have definitely had church partners come alongside us and really value the work we do, like as a congregation. And we found those churches to be the most, I would say, take the most initiative when it comes to maybe co-hosting an event or welcoming. We had a few years ago, we hosted we called this person a scholar in residence. It was Dan Seidel. He's written a couple of different books, but one of them is called God in the Gallery. And a lot of his earlier writing is focused on a Christian embrace of modern art and specifically abstract work. So he came to Charlottesville a few times and hosted some lectures, both in the community. At the time, we didn't have a gallery space, so we hosted a lecture at Chroma with him. And then he also did a couple of different lectures, like within church buildings, like after a Sunday morning service, kind of during like a Sunday school hour. So I think that when we have opportunities to collaborate or partner with our church partners, whether it's through something like the Maker Series or a lecture we can actually host or a conversation or discussion we can host within those church buildings, we've definitely found our congregational partners to be really receptive to that. And a few years ago, something that we're interested in doing again, we hosted an ecumenical woodcut workshop. So we had a local artist facilitate like an actual workshop on how to make woodcuts, but we focused it around a particular season of the church calendar. And then each participating congregation received a set of those woodcuts as well as the participants that actually were in the workshop. And that was great because, this is my full-time job, and I've been here for going on 8 years. And so I get to experience denominations working together pretty consistently, but we hear from pastors and partners that being in a space, whether it's on the board or whether it's in the gallery or at a woodcut workshop, but having those churches work across denominational lines is a huge thing for them and really adds value to their life in our community and also within their parish or congregation.
That's that question becomes so big in some ways, I think, and it's I don't quite know how to deal with it, but I want to move on here because we're getting kind of close to the end, but I kind of want to share, ask you. I know you've been to other places. You've traveled, at least I imagine you've traveled. That you've been outside of Roanoke or Charlottesville a few times. But I wonder, as you go to a new place, so when you came to Roanoke last year, or when you go to another new place, what are kind of the things that you look for to see whether things are going well or not? Other than, of course, it sounds like going to the mall.
That's a really interesting question, and I do not feel like I have the ability to answer that. I definitely do not consider myself an expert on how well other towns are doing, but I will say that when I think about planning like a weekend vacation or a trip or something like that, I think that walkability is huge. For me personally, like I love finding neighborhoods we can walk in, visiting different spots. And I think that, I want to use Roanoke as an example because I had never been before. But I think that I was really impressed by, particularly at Expo, I felt like the engagement of people, like the people I met who were really actively engaged in the community, asking all the questions that, we've talked about in this podcast, but that you specifically have talked about, specifically with soup, like how the Roanoke community is approaching new initiatives, community building work, community development work. I think that when places have a walkable feel that, makes neighborhoods or part of the town feel like human scale, they have things to do. So cultural events, like community theater, concerts, galleries, probably great food, I mean, maybe that's just important to me, but I feel like towns, both places that are kind of like icons of the community, right? Like a diner that's been there forever, but also new restaurants that are experimenting with things. Like we kind of try to find both whenever we're traveling. And often when we're traveling, I'll try to meet up with someone that I know, or someone who's leading an organization whose work I really admire. And those people often introduce me to, like, for example, the work that you all are doing, or work that I feel like is really interesting. So if I think about, like, how we plan our agenda when we're, like, traveling, or, like, our itinerary, I feel like those are often different sort of community parts or spaces that as, like, a tourist, I feel like are interesting to explore.
Well, yeah. From that answer, you were eminently qualified to answer that question, so don't doubt yourself.
Well, how would you answer that question? Like, if you came to Charlottesville, how would you decide if that community, like, what would be some things that would stick out to you to, like, decipher if the community is thriving?
I think public art is a huge thing. Public art and small locally owned businesses are probably the two easiest indicators to see. But then there's a number of other things. So, I mean, like, I think your walkability is a huge thing to call out. And, I don't know. I feel like there's a number of things that I noticed that I don't necessarily think of. So I'm thinking, varied architecture probably matters, although that's not something I think about very often. But at the core, I think it's probably just a feeling of energy, which I don't quite know how to define. But, I think when you go to a place that doesn't have energy, you kind of feel that. And when you can go to a place that has a vibrancy, you feel that vibrancy. But then now you got me going. But I feel like that energy has to be authentic. And there are certainly communities that you go to that you're like, I don't know that I believe in this, in what I'm feeling right now from this place.
Yeah. That, I was having this conversation with someone earlier, but I feel like community design, like the design of a town or a character, having the varied architecture, having public art, having these really energized spaces, whether it's a locally owned business or, in Charlottesville, we have this sort of downtown pedestrian mall. And I feel like these spaces that physically facilitate connection imply that the decision-making was a creative one, prioritizing sort of the local economy. I definitely think those are important. I feel like someone should interview you on this podcast and ask you all of these questions.
No. That's that's not my role. I'm much more comfortable on this side. Well, very good. I wonder, you mentioned you've been doing this 8 years, coming up on 8 years now. Is there something that you've learned in that time that's stuck with you, or kind of something you didn't expect you would think was so important at this point?
Oh, so many things. I have learned so much in this job. And I've been thinking about this question, and there's this really wonderful, I think it's a blog post. I'm not trying to defer the answer, but there is this blog post written by a sort of community arts hero of mine, Laura Zabel, who leads Springboard for the Arts in Minneapolis, and this is a few years ago, and I sort of stumbled across it. But it's very short, but I think it's called like Abundance and Air Conditioning is like the title of the post. But she talks about operating out of a culture of abundance instead of a sort of culture of scarcity, which I think struck me because for a long time I was the only employee of New City Arts, and we're incredibly small. We're still small in terms of scale of a community arts organization, but she encourages community arts leaders to basically operate out of this belief that resources are abundant and that we're not competing against other arts organizations. We're not competing against other nonprofits. I mean, of course, we're like all applying for grants, and there is, obviously development is an aspect of this work, but she basically makes a case that for leaders who operate out of this place of abundance, they're able to be more generous, more effective, collaborate more, have more sort of like serendipitous events, connections, community partnerships by doing things like picking up the tab when you like take someone out for coffee, or saying yes to a meeting or a partnership opportunity that like may not seem obvious at first. And of course you can't, she's not encouraging everyone to like have no boundaries, but she is encouraging people to not operate out of this like competitive leadership stance, which creates this really negative feeling, especially in a small town where collaboration can only benefit one another. We often say that First Fridays and galleries kind of operate like vineyards, like the more there are in a concentrated location, the better it is for everyone because you'll have more visitors for each one. And remembering that, believing that, and operating out of that mentality, supporting each other, and knowing your strengths, knowing when you're asked to participate or collaborate in something, and knowing when and if you can actually add value, and then knowing when you can, if someone approaches you and says, I really want to make this happen, or I really want to do this event, and saying like, you know what, actually this other organization is working on something that I think would really fit with you, and is an organization that can really support the work you're doing here. I'm going to make an introduction to the director at the Bridge, for example. Laura just wrote this really lovely article about how that kind of posture leads to effective work and more generous work. And I think that sort of over the course of 8 years or however long it's been, that has continued to be true when I find myself like getting in, not operating out of that mentality. I feel like I don't like that version of myself. I feel like we're less effective, more isolated, less connected to the community. And so I think that her advice is really important. And there's another leader, sort of arts leader, Nathan Marion, who's based in Seattle. And within the last year or two, he wrote this wonderful piece. I think it was actually an interview. And in it, he talks about how community arts organizations like theaters, galleries, whatever, are actually competing against Netflix, not one another. So, which I think is this, nothing against Netflix. Like, I love, watching a good show after dinner. Like, it's not about that. But when we think about, like, inviting people out to an event on a Friday night, it's the end of a work week. People are exhausted. It's like, it's time for dinner. It's, like 5 to 7:30. And, or, even like an evening event, if we're talking about a community concert or something, like, the more we can support other arts organizations, other art spaces, I feel like the better the sort of community life is in a town, and the more support there is for sort of cultural infrastructure and cultural happenings. So anyways, that's a really long way to say that I feel like partnership, collaboration, vulnerability, authenticity, all those things are the most important way to operate when we're thinking about creativity and arts community in a small town. And I think that that's an ongoing lesson and involves a lot of listening, a lot of coffee meetings, which are my favorite. And yeah, anyways, Laura Zabel is the person who wrote that piece, and I think you can find it if you Google her name and air conditioning.
But as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, man, someone should write a book about the words that we need to reclaim in community development work. And whimsy and generosity and abundance and vulnerability are all should be on that list somewhere. Yeah,
definitely. I agree.
Well, I kind of hate to do this, but I wonder if you can close us out with a story that encapsulates what you think can happen when communities work well or when they really embrace the arts.
Oh, these are big questions. I think what first comes to mind is probably we haven't talked about this much, and I don't mean to sort of get us off track, but one of the things we do is a program called Housing to Home, and in that work we work in partnership with the Haven, who lead the Housing First initiatives in Charlottesville. So for people who are experiencing homelessness, whether it's chronic homelessness, temporary homelessness, whether they even work with clients who are like about to become homeless, so homelessness prevention. With those clients, when they move them into a place, whether it's for 6 months or a year, one of the programs we run is helps those particular people when they move into these new places, make them more personal, more comfortable by providing them with a stipend to have choice over their space. So they choose furniture, art, plants, whatever it is that makes them feel at home and safe in the space. That's what Housing to Home is. So our program manager, Lindsay Leahy, is the person who leads that program, and she spends a lot of time with those clients learning what they love, what home looks like to them, learning more about their situation. And this program was evolved out of a long-term partnership we had with the Haven, where we ran studio space and had our office actually in their building in exchange for facilitating a program in their day shelter. And talk about community embracing the arts. This was a cross-sector collaboration that honestly, it was a huge gift to us to have this partnership with an established organization with leaders in the nonprofit community across sectors. We were able to facilitate creativity, arts workshops, that sort of thing, with people in our community who are some of the most vulnerable. And it took, the Haven took a risk, like letting us do this with them. And over time, as this evolved, and the Haven took on more housing initiatives, it required a lot more financial support when we started to integrate these aspects of choice and creativity and imagination into these homes, like into actual homes, not just these facilitated workshops and things in the day shelter. And actually, your most recent Expo podcast guest, Jamie Bennett, who runs Art Place, is one of our funders. So Art Place actually funded the pilot program of Housing to Home, which has now been going on for 2 years. And I think that Housing to Home is this, I think it encapsulates so many things that we've been talking about on this podcast. I think it required trust and friendship and authenticity. It required risk-taking. It absolutely required this sort of like culture of abundance, right? The Haven gave us a space to work in. It created these friendships. And what we've seen through that program is that art and creativity are able to be integrated into the homes of people who have been living in community, right? When someone is experiencing homelessness, it's a very communal existence. You're sleeping next to 40 other people if you're in a temporary shelter. You're constantly eating meals with tons of other people that are at a soup kitchen or at the Haven for breakfast. And you have this tight-knit community that's experiencing honestly often traumatic things, like alongside one another and providing the support system. So when people in that particular context end up in housing, and again, this is all stuff that I have like picked up from working alongside experts in this sort of field and the social service providers who are really doing the on-the-ground work. So I do not by any means claim that any of this is a universal experience for these folks. But we found that when they were moving into housing, it became a very isolated experience because they were living alone, often for the first time in a few years, in spaces that didn't reflect who they were and didn't meet their needs. Like maybe they didn't even have curtains, which, to them might symbolize safety, privacy, comfort. And so receiving community support, financial support, a huge, risk that the Haven took by partnering with us on this project. I think Housing the Home really demonstrates how creativity and imagination can transform a community. And we don't see this a lot because the stories of our clients are private and personal, and so we don't share them often. But something that has really impacted me personally from this program is that one of the first things that many of our clients purchase are things like futons to host family members or dining room tables so they can have their family over for a holiday or a birthday, porch furniture because they're now in a neighborhood, they're kind of situated in a new context, and they want to sip coffee on their porch in the morning and meet the people who walk by. And that kind of reconnection to community that is happening through these creative personal choices, to me, is this beautiful, I think, demonstration of the power that kind of work can have in an individual person's life, but then can actually impact a community on kind of a larger scale, helping to integrate these clients back into Charlottesville as a neighbor, as a neighbor. So anyways, I know we didn't talk a lot about Housing the Home, but I think for me it connects with a lot of the other work we do because we believe art is a tool for connection and community and action. And I think seeing it happen on a day-to-day basis in the lives of our friends is really powerful.
Well, I think that's a great way to kind of bring things to a close. It encapsulates so much of the great work that you guys do, which is only seems to be expanding. And I wonder if people are interested in learning more about Housing the Home or any of the work that you guys are doing in New City Arts. Where can they find more information?
Yeah, I think the easiest thing to do is to go to our website, which is newcityarts.org. My email's on there. You can fill out the form on our website. And we love coffee meetings, as I mentioned. We also love email. So feel free to contact me or Lindsay, and we're happy to chat more about any of the things we talked about today. And if you're in Charlottesville and want to stop by, we are open noon to 4, Monday through Friday during the week. And then our calendar on our website has all of our events, which we do 3 to 4 a month. Some are in the morning, some are at night. We are super excited to be launching Creative Mornings in Charlottesville in March, which is, I shouldn't say we, not New City Arts, but I'm one of the co-hosts, and that is a really exciting event that is every single month. It's free. There's breakfast, coffee, a creative, a speaker whose topic is for the creative community, and that's a great way to get plugged in. I think just reaching out is the best way to get connected.
Wonderful. Well, Maureen, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Once again, thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. We truly hope you've enjoyed today's episode and come away thinking more deeply about something than you were before. If you have, we'd appreciate a rating or review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you might be listening to this. It really helps other people find out about the podcast and the great guests that we have on. Further, I'd like to welcome all of you all to check us out on CityWorks XPO, that's cityworksxpo.com, and learn about our annual gathering, CityWorks 8, where this year's theme is Anticipating 2050, Acting Today. We're really excited about what we have going on this year and some of the speakers that we have coming in, and we hope you'll join us in Roanoke, Virginia from October 4th through 6th and be part of what's really a very special event. But for now, thanks again for listening and have a great week.